So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. This is the first of our 4 winter question sessions that we're hosting. This is normally run through the Northeast Tree Fruit IPM working group. New this year, we also invited folks from the Great Lake Fruit Workers to join us too. So we've got a little bit more geographic spread, but we figure since we're all working in fruit, might as well get us all together and have some conversations. So for those of you that haven't been to one of these before, we do tend to keep things pretty casual, pretty conversational. We have a couple of invited speakers today that I'm going to introduce, but again, we invite you to join in. If you have a question as we're going through things, feel free to hop in. You can ask directly. That's a-okay by me. We do have a hard stop at 1 today, though, so we'll try to keep it under that. Otherwise, I think that's pretty good for the housekeeping. So I'd like to just invite or introduce our guest today. So we have a couple of people joining us to talk about herbicides, and I think the total title was along the lines of orchard herbicides, efficacy, what are their impacts on crop damage, environmental concerns, acute effects, chronic effects. So we're going to try to run the gamut here on a couple of these different topics in the hour that we have. So to do that, we've got a couple of experts joining us. So we have Dr. Lynn Sosnoskie from Cornell University, Dr. Thierry from Rutgers University, Dr. Maria Gannett from UMass, and we also have Doug Van Hoewyk. I'm sorry if I butchered that, Doug. He's joining us from Maine Department of Ag. He's a toxicologist with the state, so he's going to be able to give us some information on that. So thank you all for joining us today, and I guess as the MC of this one, I think I kind of just like to set the stage and really ask you all, what are, from the growers that you work with, what are the main post-emergent herbicides that we're really using at volume at this point? I know compared to our pre-emergence, there's not as many of them. And I think the list that people are actually using might be even shorter. So what are you seeing most people really using at this point in their orchards? And I don't know who wants to kick it off. Maybe Lynn's the first one on my screen. So Lynn, do you want to talk about New York for a little bit?
Well, I think you and Janet can probably talk about New York. I probably get the most questions about uh, glufosinate and paraquat, though. I would say if someone's going to call me, that's what they call me about whether paraquat resistance, which we do have in our horseweed populations, or maybe a lot of misconceptions about how well glufosinate can work or how quickly it should work, or weed size at the time of glufosinate applications, and then crop injury concerns. So those are the two most people call me about.
Okay. Terry, how about for you? What questions do you get the most about from growers in New Jersey?
I think it's pretty much along the same line as what Lynn said. Question regarding glufosinate, paraquat. Or the big one and big problems that we have here in New Jersey is yellow nut sedge in many peach orchard as well as apple orchard, and that's a problem that is caused by overuse of some specific pre-emergent herbicide. So that may be something we can discuss along the way. But yes, I mean, people are asking me a lot of questions about nut sedge control. So basically using Sandia, but also question regarding control of perennial weeds. I mean, we have a decent amount of thistle as well. So what are some of the strategies that we can deploy for controlling perennial weed species like Canada thistle, goldenrod? I have poison ivy in some orchard as well. So that's a problem.
Sure. Maria, how about Massachusetts?
Um, yeah, I guess in Massachusetts, I was surprised to get so many questions about glufosinate and whether it's contributing to the rapid apple decline or that sudden apple decline, sudden apple death, whatever you guys are calling it. I didn't know that that was something that this is my second year, so I just didn't know that that was something that people were really concerned about. Yeah, so mostly that.
Okay. And Doug, do you want to comment too? I mean, what questions you're getting from growers in Maine? which herbicides are the ones you're hearing most about?
Yeah, I get lots of questions about PFAS pesticides since Maine's enacted legislation to ban PFAS pesticides in 2032, and people's are aware of these products and their potential discontinued use. So I get a lot of those questions from growers, turf managers, even concerned citizens.
Okay, great. So a pretty good spread. It sounds like glufosinate certainly one that keeps coming up. So I wonder maybe we should spend a little bit of time just talking about glufosinate and uh, some of the common things that we hear from growers on that one. I know this is gonna drive you all crazy, but I think the quote that I hear is, "Oh, that's the same as glyphosate, right?" And I'm sure I'm not the only one who gets that. Um, can we talk a little bit about that and dispel some of the grower myths around that?
Yeah, so I will just argue. I get a lot of, I have gotten several emails that have used glyphosate and glufosinate interchangeably, and I then have to call, right back, like, do you mean Rely or generics, or are we talking Roundup, those products? And so I think because of the similarities in their spelling and in the syllables, and that there is some confusion, and they do get used interchangeably, and that the glufosinate, why, it didn't kill this, or it only did this much injury. I thought this is supposed to be for perennial weed control. I think we're talking, could we be talking to different chemistry? So one is a contact with very limited mobility. The other is definitely systemic. So I think that is a real concern, is just similarity in the language.
I think yes, there is similarity, but there is also sometimes people are complaining that the herbicide glufosinate is not working on perennial weed species. Lynn explained why it was not the case, because it's not really a systemic herbicide. It has very minimal translocation in the plant, not sufficient for killing perennial weeds, not translocating the root of the plant by no way. The big issue that I see sometimes with glufosinate is that people jump on the tractor at 6 a.m. when there is not enough light. On glufosinate to be really active, to be functioning at the best, need to be applied under really clear sky condition. You need light. So my recommendation usually is don't do it before 10 a.m. Don't do it after 3 or 4 p.m. in the day, because otherwise you will see a strong reduction in efficacy of glufosinate if you apply it when you still have, either cloudy condition or low light condition. No, glufosinate needs to be applied when you have very bright light condition.
Also, warmer temperatures and humidity can help performance of glufosinate. The other is a glufosinate label has also very specific recommendations or requirements for nozzles, and I've gotten drift calls, and people using nozzles that produce a fine droplet and having damage to leaves because of that as well. Also, people going after weeds that are way too big. When I worked in cotton, we said that, when I was working with Palmer amaranth in cotton, if it was over 3 to 4 inches, you're not going to control this weed with glufosinate. That potential for just having kind of damage to the top part of the plant, and then having buds breaking and regrowth. I think learning from kind of our agronomic partners, if some things, if they get bigger over the size of a soda can, especially if people are kind of confusing it with glyphosate and thinking systemic activity, this is not that herbicide. Your chance of escapes can be significant, especially if the application conditions aren't ideal.
Right. That's great, Lynn. I like to think of, when I talk to growers, I'm like, these materials, these contact materials, if you're looking for a Hail Mary, they're not it. If they've already escaped them, you're asking for a miracle, and you're not very likely to get it. So I think that is a big concern. And I just wanted to comment too on the conditions for glufosinate. I always kind of laugh because when we were doing our experiments with the backpack sprayer, totally out of my Tyvek suit. If it was a really miserable day and I was ready to pass out, I knew the glufosinate was probably going to work that day. If I wasn't super uncomfortable, then odds were good it wasn't going to be a good application. So yeah, that hot and humid is certainly important.
On Michael, one last thing on glufosinate is that that's one of the few herbicide post-emergence for which I will systematically use ammonium sulfate when I mix it for improving the activity of glufosinate. I will never do that with glyphosate. I don't think glyphosate need any adjuvant, but glufosinate for sure need to be mixed with ammonium sulfate for really improving activity.
Okay, that's good to know. I see, Terry, you have your hand
Yeah,
up.
and I think this is also going to address Jeremy's question that just popped up in the chat. I used to say 20 years ago, or whenever glufosinate came out, that it had the activity of paraquat and the human safety anyway, or mammalian safety of glyphosate, at least before glyphosate got sort of a black eye that I like to still fight against. But and then Dave Rosenberger scared everyone away with the question about the cankers on the trunks. And can we talk 20 years later about people's experiences with trunk cankers and tree decline? Because in my experience with glyphosate, both in our own orchard and with commercial growers, a lot of folks have been switching over to the contact materials. One time a grower was spraying a paraquat, another contact material, and I was kind of surprised. This was 10 or 15 years ago when most people had been moving away from it. And he said, Terry, paraquat doesn't kill trees. Meaning glyphosate does. And I still want to think about, does glufosinate still have that reputation, and should we maybe rethink that?
I mean, from the perspective, this is like zero fact. So then we're going to pass it over to Lynn, but I would definitely back that up, Terry, that I hear when I first started the job 6 years ago, it seemed like everybody was jumping on the glufosinate bandwagon, thinking that other products would kill the tree. And now all of a sudden I've started hearing a lot of growers are switching back to paraquat for that exact reason, because they've decided that the glyphosate and the glufosinate could be damaging the trees. And I don't necessarily know that this is based on research. I think it's just sort of the pulse of the growers. So that's where we pass it over to you, Lynn. Thanks.
Well, I do want to bring up too, I not to throw this right at Terry, but I do remember seeing a Rutgers article with cankers from glufosinate. I wonder, Terry, if you or Lynn could maybe talk a little bit about that work.
Yes. I mean, my predecessor, not me, had some ideas on this one, and I'm not sure that I'm sharing the same kind of ideas, because I did for 3 years in one of our research stations, Northern Jersey. In a young apple plantation, we applied glufosinate, and I was over 3 years never been able to replicate trunk injury on trunk cancer, nothing like that. I think it's like for many things, it's maybe a revelator, it may be magnifying some pre-existing condition on the trees, but by itself on perfectly healthy tree, I didn't see any direct damage from glufosinate, causing trunk canker or things like that.
So I was going to say, this is actually one thing I have wanted to do. And when I have time and money, even though I told Terry that I'm really tired of a bunch of herbicide trials, but if I have time and money, like I have wanted to put young trees in the ground and just sort of blast them with like everything. Right. And see if we can do like the most sensitive, how much damage we do to the trunks itself. Brad Hansen in California, he and one of his students in almonds actually did this trial. And for the love of God, I cannot find that. I don't know if that paper has not been published or if it has, and I just can't find it, but I know that they were doing this specifically on almond trees because they had the same questions. The only thing I can find, and this is interesting, is that there's actually the big concern in almonds right now in California is actually glufosinate residues transferring to the almonds because they shake the almonds onto the ground and the glufosinate on the ground getting on the almond husks. And then do they have an issue? But that's an interesting aside of kind of where kind of the science is going. But that being said, this work has been at least done to some extent purposely, not just anecdotally, purposely. I just can't find it. But I know we did it.
That's great to know. If you dig up that paper, please share it with the group. I'd be curious to have a look at that too.
Yeah, so they have been doing like with like propionyl drift and fluoroperoxyfen drift and triclopyr drift, but I do know that there is a direct we hit this purposely, and I'll find it.
Okay. Well, I wanted to check too, one of the rules of thumb that I've always heard, shifting gears a little bit in regards to glyphosate. We've always kind of been telling growers and from predecessors, don't use it past the solstice. I use 4th of July just because I need that extra week to get my act together. But I do know there are some growers that will apply it, all the way through the fall. So just wanted to kind of get a read of the room. I mean, how dangerous are those fall applications in causing tree damage? Any thoughts?
I guess I had a paper that looked at the differences between glyphosate 2,4-D and triclopyr applied to the bark and then also branches. And I'm trying to find it right now so that I can look. I don't remember what time of year this was applied, but definitely the branches for the glyphosate was quite dangerous and could kill the peach trees. But on the apples, it was like not even really killing the apples. But again, I can't remember the time of year, so I'll look that up now. But it was the most dangerous of those 3 that they compared.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing.
As long as it was the bark and not.
Sure.
I think, Mike, what I say when I'm using glyphosate is that I like it for perennial weed control, and I try to put it in September. Why? Because I want to make sure that the product is absorbed by the plant and can move back to the rhizome, to the roots, and kill perennial weeds. So same principle applied to apple, I think, is that if you have any kind of suckers at this time of the year, you probably don't want to get glyphosate applied because any absorption at this time may end up by translocating to the roots of the trees as well.
Okay. So yeah, still pretty much that rule of thumb, especially if you have root suckers, then probably going to follow still.
Well, better to be safe than to be sorry in that case.
Right,
if you don't have any control of your sucker, if there is a risk of absorption, clearly later in the season, there is a greater risk for the glyphosate to be absorbed, translocated to the roots, on causing carryover injuries the following year. I mean, you would see the damage the following year.
Sure. All right, thank you. Terry, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I've got a question. I've sort of done a little bit of the opposite, where I try to put it on as late as possible so that the leaves are off and the leaves are off of the suckers and things that maybe hardened up a little bit. And am I foolish? Am I doing sort of a chronic harm by doing that? Because we sprayed. It was right before the NC 140 meeting, so I think it was like November 4th or something this year in Burlington, Vermont. That's pretty darn late. And we could see it, activity until the snow came first week of December. But I'm hoping that's going to start us off on a better foot going into next spring. And I don't know, just riff on whether or not you can go late enough that maybe the tree kind of hard. And this is specifically with glyphosate.
I think as long, if the leaves of the trees are down, you're probably in a relatively safe position because there's probably not much translocation happening in the tree anymore. Everything has already been moved back to the roots. As long as you don't, as long as you don't have any kind of green tissue, leaf or green bark that can be targeted by the glyphosate spray, you should be fine. It's funny that you say that because I use it the same way, but in spring, I do a lot of work in blueberry, and actually I use glyphosate before the blueberries are going out of dormancy for targeting some weeds that are out of dormancy before the blueberries. So I'm using this narrow window in spring for targeting some perennial weed with glyphosate when the blueberries are actually dormant as well.
So I have some thoughts about this, and Thierry brought up a really, really good point, is how late is too late, you know, or how early is too early. And I think about it from like a weed control standpoint. By the way, I texted Brad Hansen. They are writing that paper right now. On almonds, but he said there might be some work out there by Marcello Moretti on hazelnuts. But thinking about the timing of these fall applications, and I you know, full disclosure, sometimes as a weed scientist, I am so focused on the weeds, like I don't even notice the crop is there, right? You know, like those, like I'm really focused, but I often think about timing of applications. Obviously, you can go too early with glyphosate. You don't have the plants out of the ground. You know, there's not enough surface area, you know, leaf tissue to capture to actually, you know, to have enough taken in. You know, the phloem is moving in the wrong direction, and so you're not getting good control. There was some work that was done on field bindweed. It was back in the 70s and 80s that they found you could go too late, that you didn't have that adequate translocation like in the fall, because the plant is shutting down. So it's lost its leaves. You know, the leaves are, it's either losing leaves, or the plant metabolically, physiologically is just shutting down. So you have kind of like a bell curve with the glyphosate efficacy on field bindweed. And there can be a too late, you know, saying, oh, well, a fall application is better for this. You know, the plants have their own, like, well, time for me to stop. And I don't think that we have actually really defined that well for both weeds and crops about when this maximum safe or maximum performance window might be, or if we do, it's very wide, but also safety window. You know, there's not a lot of us working in the space, and so we haven't really thought about those questions. But to sort of bring up what Thierry said is that, you know, the leaves are gone. You know, we're reached a point that there is a safe window. And actually, in like California, the winter dormant season, you know, it's not as cold. They're not covered in snow. It's not iced over. We use a lot of those herbicides in those production systems because that is the safe time to use it. And we have the fleabanes, the goose grasses, the rye grasses and stuff. And so we are treating orchards at that time.
All right, that's really interesting, Lynn. Obviously, looking outside and seeing the 2 feet of snow.
Well,
things are very different in California for us, right? But that's a great point. I do have a little bit of a kind of a follow-up to that. You know, I think that's one of the things that we struggle with, thinking about efficacy for a lot of these perennial weed species, particularly field bindweed. That's one that I have struggled with, as I'm sure most of us have. Because, you know, you look on the label and it says wait till it's starting to flower. Our big issue is by the time it's starting to flower, they're already wrapped 8 feet up high around the tree. So like, how do I hit it at that point, right? So I think it's tough to really know when exactly to hit it, trying to kind of gauge when the plant's going to be most susceptible to it, when the crop's going to be least susceptible to it, and just what's physically possible with the sprayer that you have. So a lot of things to think about there. I do want to just wrap back to something Vaughn put in the comments. Vaughn, feel free to unmute yourself and just, you know, talk about it a little more directly. But I think his comment was that with the super dwarfing trees that we have now, are we just never getting to that point where we have that really good mature bark? Is that potentially just making it so that even our mature trees are more susceptible to potential injury?
Yeah, it's just something I've wondered about. We see all these unexplained cankers and tree damage and everything. And, you know, traditionally those herbicides like Allion and some others that on the label they say it's safe after 4 or 5 years of tree age and good brown mature bark. On a lot of these super dwarfed systems, either we never see that good brown mature bark like we used to, or it's much later in the tree's lifespan. And I wonder if when we start switching over to those herbicides at 5 years old or whatever on the tree, if maybe some of them are not totally tree safe yet at that point.
Yeah, so I think Vaughn has a really, really good point. I think there's a lot that we don't know. Or we're basing a lot off of, sometimes when we end up doing research trials, we end up doing them in, well, nobody wants to be in this block, right? And it's a much older block. It's not necessarily, representative of the true commercial, system that we're doing it in. If you're at any of the Lake Ontario fruit meetings, I'm actually going to be discussing the symptomology associated with allium damage. That might be helpful for understanding if you're seeing that. Again, these are things I know Thierry and I have talked about would be great things to test and study. It's finding time to do it, and a group who wants to support the research.
But I mean, to Vaughn's point, I would say that I can understand and I may agree with that clearly with some of these herbicides, glyphosate, glufosinate, you don't want this herbicide to be sprayed on any kind of green tissue. So indeed, if we have trees, dwarf rootstock that where the bark is not getting solid, when you're using this herbicide, if you still have green tissue, yes, the risk of crop injury is increased, in my opinion. So that's maybe part of the risk. If that's the case, I've not been looking at this one, but if that's the case, if you still have green bark, yeah, clearly that's a potential issue when you use a product like glyphosate or glufosinate. Actually, I've seen on glufosinate, what I remember seeing that on in blueberry, but on new canes, sometimes we have the problem that when the new canes of the blueberry is coming out of the ground, if you spray glufosinate at this time, unlike paraquat, where you just have a spot, a necrotic spot, and it's not spreading around, what I've seen with glufosinate, you're getting girdling, meaning that you have the impact of the droplet on the cane, and it's moving a little bit around, and it's enough for killing the cane because you're getting this necrotic tissue surrounding the entire cane and preventing any sap to move forward. So that's a problem with glufosinate. It's not moving really deep, but it has some local movement inside the plant that you don't have with paraquat.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say to bring up one thing that Thierry brought up is the compounding injury in perennial crops. Unlike annuals that we can replant and we can replant in a different field, you have a crop in place, over extended time, and that, damage in 1 year from one practice or one environmental condition, and then with another practice or environmental condition, that at the same time, it can also become difficult to ferret out what are the largest contributing factors, but that we have to be thinking that injury can enhance sensitivity to, I think, realistically, to the tools that we're using for weed management.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lynn. I do remember reading, I think it was an old Scaffolds article that Dave Rosenberger put together, and his anecdotal thoughts were very much around that, potentially certain herbicides being applied in hot, dry conditions could potentially lead to sunburn, then being compounded by winter damage, then being compounded by brown rot or white rot cankers, and then ultimately that could lead to that grafting of the trunk. So it's kind of this slow burn where all these different things are kind of playing into each other. So yeah, a lot of complicated things when we get into these perennial systems.
I think there was a question about the tree painting, and you and Janet actually did that. So
Yep, that is a great segue. So yeah, Daniel asked about what if we're painting trunks or putting tree guards on. We did look at that in one of our studies for, I think, 3-year period, and I don't think we really found any, real burning gun conclusions one way or the other. That particular study was in 3-4-year-old trees already too, so they had already gotten some early applications before we put any protection on. We have another study that we put the protection on shortly after planting, and I think we're in year 4 or 5 of that now. So we have 2 sites in Eastern and Western New York, respectively. I don't think we've seen any differences to date in Western New York. Janet, feel free to jump in and correct me. I think your planting conditions are just too good out at the site that you picked. In Eastern New York, it's been interesting. We did have one particular scenario where temperatures dropped down, I think, 50 degrees in the course of 48 hours. And we actually did lose somewhere between 5 to 10% of the trees in that planting. And the trees that had some type of protection, particularly with paint, survived better compared to those that didn't. But was that due to the herbicides, or did it just give a little bit of insulation from the cold? I'm not really sure. So, and as Lynn just put into the chat box too, I know there's been some studies out west too in other crops like hazelnuts, and I think I've seen something in almonds where they looked at that too. And I think it was one of those where one study found one worked, another found it didn't. So it would be kind of really interesting to do some type of meta-analysis where we take all those studies and see what those overall results were. But I wonder if anyone else has any experience with that as far as trunk guards and protecting against damage.
On a similar subject, some of my very small growers sometimes come up with their own ways to shield the trunks just during the herbicide spray. And there's no studies to say if that is or isn't working, but I'm wondering if anybody else has growers sort of retrofitting ways to prevent the herbicide from contacting the trunk, or if any of the spray rigs are trying to get into that market of coming up with some sort of a bar that gets in the way between the spray and the trunk. Just sort of brainstorming.
I know there are shielded sprayers. I don't see a lot
Yeah.
of my growers with them, but I know they exist.
I've retrofitted our sprayer with a 15-gallon like milk wash barrel cut in half and bolted it over the top, and even had a little curtain on the back end. Actually, it was an old mud flap from a truck, I think. And that worked pretty well until it keeps getting caught on things and jerking things around. But that's more of an engineering issue. In terms of implication on management, what I find is that leaves what I call the mohawk down the middle, because it's not getting in between the trunks. The better you get in between the trunks, the more you're going to hit the trunks. So it works. I don't like the old, thinking back 25 years ago when we used to spray Roundup right through the tree, right through the trunk, that was nice. But we shouldn't be doing that. So I don't know the best answer. And I don't have one of the fancy ones with the little, trigger switch or anything like that.
So Terry and I actually do have the fancy ones with the See and Spray system, and we can share our data at some point in time. I did it in grapes. Terry did it in blueberries. I will say here at Geneva they have kind of retrofitted their sprayer to also not be truly shielded, but to try and minimize crop contact, off target movement. That doesn't seem to work, and therefore, to some extent, there is an applicator issue that you know, that also can override some of this, you know, because I still see trees that, you know, particularly younger trees that have clearly been damaged, and so you know, spraying under conditions like in newly planted orchards and vineyards where the wind is racing, you know, and they're spraying, and we are getting that off target movement, you know, that there's there's an element to that also needs to be addressed, I think, sometimes.
Sometimes Lynn mentioned it, but yes, Lynn and I, we have this system that we work with for, you know, detecting the weed and spraying them with herbicide. But what I learned from my mistake is that you're better to position the boom at the right height if you do that, because if you put the boom a little bit too high, even if you have a shielded system, you will still get injuries. So the positioning of the boom and making sure that the boom is not, you know, even with shield, if the boom is too high, you will still get herbicide eating the trunk. So to Janet's question, I would say that in New Jersey, especially South Jersey for peach tree, I think I see many growers using cardboard on 1, 2, up to 3 years old planting just to make sure that they're protecting, because yes, some of them have been losing, especially in our sandy soil, not just from this post-emergence herbicide clearly, but they've been losing some trees from herbicide injuries. So I see a lot of cardboard protection, you know, paraffin cardboard wrapped around the trunk of these young trees.
So with the weed hit sprayer that Thierry did, he did his work in blueberries. So he had a real issue, is because those blueberries regenerate from those new canes right at the base. I did mine in grapes, and I had already suckered my grapes, so I had a lot of safety in my trials. I had even used 2,4-D in my trials, and 2,4-D and grapes don't mix. But because I was putting out so much less 2,4-D and I was directing it, I actually saw greater safety. Now, this was just an experimental study to show whether the technology can work. I will say Thierry and I have been investigating this. We then took it to say, can we use the See and Spray technology for getting suckers, like grape suckers, like using a contact herbicide like carfentrazone? Can we now use it to do crop management? And we found out, we're working on that paper, we can do it successfully. If someone is going to say, okay, you know what, I am interested in kind of See and Spray technology, you better partner it with a good foundational residual herbicide, because if you're just relying on posts, or if things get hairy, those nozzles are always on. And you're putting out a lot more herbicide than if you were just doing, you know, your continuous application, banded application in the row itself. So they work, you know, they work. But the conditions that our current See and Spray technology that is available for orchards out there are very, very specific, and it requires like good weed control before you go and do this step of weed control.
I think, Mike, if I can just for a second, that Lynn brought a really great point, which is it's hard to discuss post-emergence weed control without discussing pre-emergence weed control. They go both in arms. There is no question about that. On one thing I've been, you know, I was mentioning yellow nutsedge as one of our major issue in South Jersey in some of our charts, and I think it's because of overuse of one specific herbicide pre-emergence. People loved using allium herbicide, and I understand why it's so great. It has such a long residual activity. But you also need to understand that depending on the kind of herbicide that you're using pre-emergence, you may be selecting for weeds that may be difficult to control with post-emergence herbicide as well. So that's something that's, when we are talking about post-emergence, yes, there is also the need for mentioning, you know, what pre-emergence can do, because they can drive your weed population basically.
Certainly, yeah. Just a follow-up on that, Thierry. I mean, do you feel like, is there potential we might be seeing tree injury from Allion being such a good product? Is that a possibility or?
Well, I didn't see any record in New Jersey. I did. I published a paper a few years ago, but remember that in New Jersey we have very sandy soil, very acidic soil. Initially Allion was not supposed to be used on blueberry because of coarse soil. I mean, when you have 90% sand content, that's a problem. We did a study for 3 years, back to back, 3 different varieties. We never got any injury. And I understood that based on the chemistry of Allion, what is really important is the pH of the soil. We have pH 4.5, 5, very acidic soil. And Allion is not really a problem in this kind of acidic soil. Now, on the West Coast, I see Lynn jumping, and I know what's happening. I mean, on the West Coast, it's a different story because they don't have the same pH clearly. So yes, it's.
I'm going to caution my experience. Like I have used Allion in trials, mostly, but on the West Coast and here on the East Coast with Relcion. I will say though, University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources on their research farm put out Allion on a 3-year-old vineyard and destroyed it. Granted, it's a very coarse soil, but I mean, it destroyed it. Like they ripped it out. I would take the label recommendations seriously for that. We do know that, so the soil applied herbicides, can come into contact with roots. They can cause damage. And so I'm not saying don't use them. Allion is a powerful product, but use it according to the label, because I have definitely seen the vine death associated. To be honest, with some of our residual herbicides, I know we're talking about tree damage. I'm gonna bring up herbicide resistance. It's very easy for us to talk about herbicide resistance from the post applications because it's very easy to see, but we're seeing increasing cases of pre-emergence applications across all of our cropping systems, and that includes orchards and vineyards, of resistance, including a new report of bluegrass resistance to Allion. So it's just a segue that that's another thing we have to be concerned about. And Thierry's thing about shifting populations. There's a grape grower in Western New York who's like, I'm using Allion. Why do I have this weed problem? And what he has is hedge bindweed, which your Allion is not going to touch, this perennial weed. So we can do such a good job that we do see these shifts. And that's where weed ID comes into play. We have to know what we're dealing with. You just can't assume all of these weeds are created equal.
Right, 100%. I do want to follow up on the resistance question and thinking about rotating with Allion. I mean, what are your recommendations for in the years off of Allion? Do you like to go with Matrix, or I like to recommend a Chateau and Prowl mixture. What are the other pre-emerges that you like to rotate between your Allion applications?
I like Chateau. The problem is that I like Chateau for broadleaf control. I don't like it so much for grass control. So I need always to find a grass herbicide, which these days is starting to be more a problem because we don't have surflan anymore. So we still have Prowl. For some crop, we don't have it in blueberry for good reason, and that can be, I can explain that later because we got a lot of crop injury because again, we put this herbicide at the wrong time, wrong soil, wrong pH. But yeah, Chateau is a good alternative in my opinion. Matrix is also a good alternative. I know that in some crop we still have Simazine as well. So Simazine is another one that I like to include in my mix. Usually I say to people in Jersey that 2 years of Allion and the third year you need to rotate to something different. Yeah, I think with Allion, which is also just to finish with Allion, something that we need to consider is that if you have a product which is still active 9 months after application, which I've seen in New Jersey, you put it on 9 months later, you still have no weeds emerging. That still means that you still have herbicide, you still have indaziflam active in the ground. And I don't want, my problem is that I don't know what is the threshold up to which we can start to see damage to the crop based on the amount of herbicide we still have in the ground. So I want to get at least 1 year without any indaziflam so we can start flushing and degrading a little bit of this herbicide, which is lasting long in the soil.
So I'm going to follow up with what Thierry said, is that I kind of agree with that 2 years, 1 year, having this alternating schedule. As far as your selection, you really pay attention to what your weeds are. Okay. We really need to know what our weed spectrum is to be, building some of those rotational programs more effectively. And I am concerned that all of these herbicides really let our perennials escape. Okay. That I'm worried regardless that we're gonna that we still select for perennial species. Now, that being said, one thing I have tested in California, I have not tested here, and I would love to, is I have found some matrix spring applications of matrix actually having a little bit of suppression of field bindweed. And I've only tested that in an annual tomato crop in California before the bindweed got out of the ground. So I'm very interested in that, but I still think perennials, like if we do get any suppression, any kind of residual chemistry, having suppression on some weed here or there, we're still going to release perennials. And then we still come back to the same problem that all we have is our post-emergent herbicides for management. So I think we're shifting. We still have shifts that we have to worry about. The other thing with Allion and our residual herbicides is if we're going to go into replant situations, if you're going to be replacing trees, in an orchard, oh, this one's died, I've got to replace this. And you have to pay attention to what you have put there already and the potential for injury to that crop. For having that treated soil going into the fill hole. And, if you're thinking about replacing a whole orchard of like the time that, be thinking about the residual longevity of these chemistries. If you're going into new orchard ground, think of the residual longevity of the chemistries that were used in a potential preceding crop. If someone's like, oh, this was in corn, okay, and be thinking about, what needs to, how you're going to handle that soil, cover crops, over a couple of seasons, particularly cover crops that can be indicator species of, residual chemistry still being there. Just another aspect, and I know this is supposed to be post-emergent, but another aspect of the pre-emergence is replanting of whether it's individual trees or orchards themselves.
Lynn, go ahead, Terry.
So we've been using in blueberry when they're replanting, and it can be the case in tree fruit as well. We've been using Sudan grass as a nice cover crop, which is a nice indicator of potential leftover herbicide in the ground. And clearly, yes, when you do, we are using norfrazone in blueberry, and it's a grass herbicide and it has long activity. And when you're putting this Sudan grass, the next year, you can be sure that you can see exactly where the blueberries rows were located, because the plants are shorter, they are white. So you still have the bleaching effect. And that can carry over easily over 2-3 years.
Wow, that's good to know. And I was going to ask Lynn, what species you recommended for cover crops. So it sounds like Sudan grass would be a really good indicator. And I like using Sudan grass for the other potential reasons for building organic matter and breaking up the ground and whatnot. So it sounds like that could be a really nice option. So that's really good to know. We are getting to about 10 minutes left of the meeting, and I know we do have that hard stop. So I do just want to pivot a little bit now. I hope Doug's still awake. Doug, I'd love to just give you an opportunity to address sort of the human health concerns, if you are up for it. And I know we kind of threw a couple different scenarios at you. So, thinking about acute human effects, potential chronic human effects, but then you also brought up the PFAS concerns too. So I just want to give you some room to, given the chemistries that we've been talking about so far today, kind of what your thoughts are on all of that.
Yeah, sure. We talk about glyphosate and glufosinate, and yeah, both those, are fairly low toxicity towards mammals, right? Because they inhibit pathways in plants that produce amino acids that, mammalian cells don't have the machinery to produce those amino acids. So, so those present low toxicity to humans. I don't get too many calls from the residents or the growers of Maine have concerns about toxicity of those two herbicides or environmental persistence. Well, for the glyphosate, I do get some calls about, concerns about persistence in sediments. But yeah, no, a lot of the questions that I get from growers, relates to PFAS and sometimes neonicotinoids, since Maine is considering a potential legislation restricting the use of neonicotinoids, and so I get lots of questions about, potential alternatives. But for the PFAS thing, I mean, it just it's hard to summarize their toxicity, when that trifluoromethyl group is incorporated to a pesticide. It's hard to summarize their toxicity because it spans so greatly, right? So there are some rodenticides, that are classified as a PFAS, and they're going to be much more toxic than, the herbicide. So I want to say, I think there are 22 herbicides that would be classified as a PFAS, but have an LD50 or a lethal dose of about 5,000. So in other words, in comparing that to salt in toxicological assays using rats, there are, many PFAS pesticides that would have lower toxicity compared to salt. So it just ranges, right? So I think a lot of the concerns with PFAS and pesticides, they might be conflating, these products with those that are more notorious, and the longer chain PFAS.
Gotcha. Okay. And I know you had sent over just a couple of materials. So, just the ones that are considered PFAS in Maine, so like Fusilade and I guess Trevix. And then you had mentioned that AIM and Venue are also fluorinated products, so those are kind of under that umbrella. In Maine, are they looking to get rid of those products or limit their use more, or what's sort of where's the legislation moving on that?
Yeah, so in 2021, Maine passed legislation to prohibit the use of the PFAS pesticides in by the year 2032. And so, yeah, so there's lots of, I guess, discussion, perhaps concern, among growers and farmers, about what alternatives might be.
Gotcha. Okay.
But for the particular, herbicides that are PFAS that, those present low toxicity to mammals.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I see a
Lynn,
question from Lynn.
Yeah.
Yes, so Lynn, so a couple of the pesticides are just fluorinated, right? They just have one fluorine attached, which would not define it as a PFAS according to the Maine or the OECD. But a couple of those products, if typically if it's a fully fluorinated carbon, containing carbon attached to 3 fluorines, then that would be pegged as a PFAS.
got you. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? I could keep asking questions all day, but we are at our last 5 or so minutes. So I just want to make sure the floor is open and people feel like they've been able to address their questions at this point. So I'll just pause for a minute to to let people type in or anything.
Can I just bring up herbicide resistance and weed shifts
Yep, by
again?
all means.
This is, I'm fatalistic. I got the name Dr. Doom by some of my growers here. The weeds always seem to win, right? The weeds always win. And everything we do, weeds adapt. Whether they're adapting for herbicide resistance or we're shifting because things are just naturally tolerant to a herbicide, or, I think what we do, we just need to be mindful of is, and I'm not saying don't do weed control, don't use herbicides, don't do this or that, but someone wins, right? And herbicide resistance is a huge problem. We tend to think of it in our annual cropping systems. That's a problem of corn. That's a problem of soy. It's not. We have growing concerns with herbicide resistance in our specialty crops, including orchards and vineyards. Part of the reason is that maybe it doesn't appear as big a problem is, again, we just don't have as many people in the sector, in the space, in investigating it. But in addition to just herbicide resistance is what Terry brought up earlier, is there shifts. We shift, we change it. We use Allion, we remove a lot of the annuals and we leave perennials that become more difficult to control. And, it's easy to say you need to diversify. It's a lot harder sometimes to do that. And we recognize that, but and it's up to us to do to work to be able to find, better tools for diversifying weed management. But I think, kind of hammering home, no silver bullet, we don't have no perfect solution exists for anyone in any system, and that we are enacting changes over time that, we talked about crop health, so there can be, impacts on the trees, but we are also changing those weed communities, and we just have to be mindful of that. And we tend to be very reactive, and to be, in part, truly, we also have to start thinking kind of proactively, like, well, if doing this, what we might be doing.
That's also why Lynn, myself, other weed scientists in the US, were working on alternative solutions as well. I understand also why we're starting to see some herbicide resistance in perennial crops, mostly because we don't have many herbicides to use. Okay, in post-emergence, we're rotating between glyphosate eventually, glufosinate, and paraquat. Lynn confirmed paraquat resistance in apple in New York 3 years ago. I confirmed resistance in horseweed in blueberries this year in New Jersey. So that's why we're also working on non-chemical control strategies. That's why Lynn and I were working with, vision-guided sprayer for really targeting the weed, minimizing broadcast application, but also working with electrical weeding. We have been doing some work along this line. Hopefully in the future, we'll get some system that can be really affordable, because electrical weeding is also something which is working great for post-emergence weed control.
Yeah,
That's
and
great.
we've done some work showing that we can partner the electrical weeding with our post-emergence herbicides to actually kind of improve the duration of performance.
Mm.
So I think there's a technology sector that's developing. It's coming a little more slowly to perennial crops, but I think it's an area that's worth exploring for sure.
That's great. I know I'm really excited to see, the electrical weeding work, and as that continues to grow and expand, I think that's really exciting. And I think you both timed that really great. That kind of just wrap things up with a neat little bow to this meeting. We are at 12:59, so we're just about done. If anyone has one last question to sneak in there, by all means, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask it. But I'd just like to thank you all for joining us for the first of this series. I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us and letting me nerd out with you all for the last hour about weed control in orchards. Our next meeting is going to be
A week
I think
from today.
Oh, thank you for Jump it in, Janet.
Yeah, we come today and it will be about sort of early spring insect management. So the question of pink insecticides and immediate at pedifall and pollinators and beneficials and pest management. So very different from the weed talks, but also hopefully interesting.
All right. Well, thank you all again. And I think we'll go ahead and call this one mischief managed. Thanks again to the speakers. Have a great day.
Thank you. See you, Mike.